All right. This week for Benchmark, we're going to start a new unit. It's called Stories Have a Narrator. So here we go with day 1.
In this unit, we will explore how people create stories. We will also learn to identify the characters and the narrator or person who is telling the story. Look at this picture. It shows a group of mice gathered around an old, wise mouse with a white beard. He is pointing to the open book behind him. Who is telling the story?
So I want you to think about that. Who do you think is telling the story? And how do people create stories?
Stories have a narrator. A story has many parts. It has a narrator who tells the story. It has a setting. It has characters. A story has a plot, which includes the beginning, the middle, and the end. Some stories are about things that could happen in real life. Some stories are about things that could not happen in real life. How do people create stories?
So that is what we will be exploring this unit.
I heard the video say that all stories have narrators. Narrators are people who tell the story. I know that sometimes a character tells the story they are in, and then it is easy to tell who the narrator is. But what about stories where the characters do not tell their own story? Do those stories have narrators? Who are they?
So what do you guys think? Do the stories of the characters not the narrator, do those stories have a narrator? Think about that, and then I'd like to know, if they do, who is the narrator? All right, so we are going to move on and we are going to listen to this very short little shared reading called Home Sweet Home.
This is an animal fantasy. It is a made-up story with an animal as a main character. In fact, the animal is the storyteller. The animal uses the word I to tell what happens. Since the cat is the storyteller, we can say that the cat is the narrator of the story.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and read this to you guys, and I want you to follow along as I read. Home Sweet Home. Do you know the yellow house? I live there. Maybe you have seen me napping on the step, or you may have seen me out walking. I don't go too far. When my lady misses me, she calls, "Here, kitty." My name is not Kitty. I will not come. But now it's dark and cold, so I slink home. I yowl, and she opens the door. "Tank!" she cries. "Where were you?" It's good to be home. So I want you to think about how this story would be different if the lady in the yellow house was the narrator of the story. What kinds of things might she say or think? And today we are going to listen to one other story. It's called The City Mouse and the Country Mouse. And in this story, while I'm reading it, I want you to be thinking and listening carefully for the important details as I read. Some of you might be familiar with this story. It is a type of fable. Remember, fables are usually stories that most often have animals as their character. And usually there's some sort of a lesson that we can learn from them. Like I said, some of you may have heard this one before. It's called The City Mouse and the Country Mouse. Now I want you to notice first here we have this character. So this at the beginning, this is who's telling the story. You can see him down here. I visited my dear cousin Kate, who lives in the country. It was a big change for me because I live in the city. However, perhaps change is a good thing. I was eager for new adventures. Kate worked hard from morning to night, gathering berries and nuts. Her home was inside a plain old log. At night, it was so quiet, I couldn't sleep. Country life was boring. I thought Kate needed some excitement, so I invited her to visit my city home. Now, if you look right here, now we have Kate telling the story. I visited my cousin Clyde, who lives in a fancy house in the city. When he led me into the dining room, I could hardly believe my eyes. There were breads, cheeses, and fruit on the table. It was a feast, and everything looked delicious. As we began eating, 2 huge cats appeared. We dashed into a small hole and hid. My heart was pounding. When they left, Clyde continued eating, watchful for the cats. However, I headed home, where it's peaceful. Clyde didn't understand why. I explained, different folks like different things. All right, so I want us to think about the important details from the story, but it's important that we tell them in order. So I'm going to page back for a minute. We're going to see what the first thing that happened was. So if I look, we have the mouse here, and you know what? I know what his name is, do you? It actually told us in the second part when Kate was talking. So this was Clyde, and the first thing that happened is he went to visit Kate in the city. So let's go type that as the first important detail, because the story wouldn't be the same or make sense if without that detail. So that is an important detail. So Clyde visits Kate in the country. Now let's think about what happens next. The next important detail. So if we go back, so he went and visited her. Now he told us some details about how she worked and that she lived in a log. And those are nice details to have. But even if we didn't have those details, we know that she lives in the country. So the story would still make sense. But we did learn something else about Clyde. We learned that he thought it was too quiet and boring, so that he wanted to leave. So I think that is our next detail that we need to add. So we'll say that country life is too boring and Clyde went back to the city. Because if he didn't do that, our story would have changed a little bit more. All right, so next, I think that brought us through this page. So then we met Kate. And so then remember, she went to the city. That's a pretty important detail because, again, if she didn't go to the city, the rest of the story would not make sense, or it would be a completely different story. So let's go write that. Kate visits Clyde. Can't type today. I really can't type today, boys and girls. Let's try that. There we go. Kate visits Clyde in the city. Okay. Now, what did she think of this city? Now, it told us that it does tell us that they had lots of food and breads and cheeses. It was a feast. And again, those are great details that make the story more interesting. But even if it did not tell us that, the story would still make sense. But we know that she leaves it. Well, why does she leave the city? Well, it's because it was dangerous because of those cats. So we could say something like, there was cats trying to get the mice so they didn't feel safe. I'm going to say it this way. I'm going to say city life is too noisy and dangerous. That was an important detail from the story. And so then what happens? Well, where did Kate go? Kate goes back to the country. So they both found out that they liked it exactly where they already were at. So